Vaughn stood in the center of his perfectly clean, minimalist apartment, his phone trembling in his hand like a butterfly caught in a web. Outside the huge panoramic window, the gray, gloomy cityscape stretched out, slowly sinking into the evening twilight, lighting up a myriad of cold lights. But inside him a hurricane raged, making his heart beat wildly. "Congratulations, you passed the final interview. When can you start?" The HR manager's voice was joyful and triumphant, but to Vaughn, it sounded like the voice of fate, announcing the beginning of a new, but unsettling phase in his life. This was his dream job. Not just a job, but a goal that had consumed him for 5 long years. 5 years of nights spent hunched over a computer coding. 5 years of drinking incredible amounts of coffee to stay awake. 5 years of turning down get-togethers with friends, vacations, and simple human joys. All those years he lived in Spartan conditions, denying himself everything to save money for courses, certifications, and new technologies. He drove himself forward like a racehorse, believing that one day this path would lead to success. And now that day had come. A job at a major tech company that he could only have dreamed of. A salary 3 times his previous one, opening up entirely new horizons for him. Career prospects that seemed to have no limits. It was all like a mirage in the desert that had suddenly become a reality, dazzling him with its brilliance. He felt euphoria wash over him like a wave, only to recede, leaving a cold emptiness in its wake. Next to him, as if in contrast to his internal chaos, was his white, curly-haired poodle, Millie. Her fur was as white as a cloud, soft as down, and it shone in the light of the desk lamp. Her dark, intelligent eyes were full of boundless love and devotion. She sensed her owner's tension, the nervous energy that vibrated in the air, and she tried to calm him, bringing him her favorite, slightly worn toy, an old rubber duck. She wagged her tail. Her happy panting filled the air, and she was the embodiment of everything that was real and sincere in his life. She didn't know about career prospects or what a salary was. She only knew Vaughn, his scent, his voice, his touch. But in this joyful, triumphant moment, there was one insoluble problem. It sounded like a verdict and shattered all his euphoria. "We provide a company apartment in an elite complex. However, there are strict rules there. No pets." These words, simple and emotionless, came crashing down on him like an avalanche, burying all his dreams and hopes. He looked at Millie, who, sensing his gaze, pressed herself trustingly against his leg, laying her small snow-white head on his shoe. He didn't remember when he got her, but he remembered why. 5 years ago, after a difficult and painful divorce, he was left alone. His ex-wife, Catherine, had left him for someone else, leaving him in an empty apartment where every corner reminded him of a lost love. He felt broken, crushed, and the loneliness weighed down on him with all its might. And that's when he got the puppy. He needed someone who wouldn't judge, who would love him just as he was, no conditions. And Millie became his everything. She was his friend, his family, his most reliable, most loyal companion. She never betrayed him, never left, never abandoned him. Now the dog who was his everything had become an obstacle to his future, to his success, to his new, bright, brilliant life. He stood as if between 2 worlds. The world where he, Millie, his old cozy apartment, and his familiar, though not so happy way of life existed. And the world where there was a new job, prestige, money, and an emptiness that had no place for the one who was his everything. He felt something break inside him as his heart, which had just been full of joy, filled with pain. But he knew he had to make a choice. And that choice he thought was obvious. He had to choose between his career and a dog's devotion. In his head, like a broken record, his ex-wife's phrase played, "You always choose work over living relationships." He had considered it an unfair accusation back then. But now, looking at Millie, he understood that maybe she was right. This wasn't just a choice between a job and a dog. It was a choice between his old life and a new one, between the past and the future, between who he was and who he wanted to become. And he thought, had already made that choice, even though his heart was breaking from the pain. The unthinkable choice. Vaughn stood by the window, pressing his forehead against the cold glass. The city skyline, studded with twinkling lights, seemed just as inaccessible and distant as his brilliant new life. Inside him, a cocktail of euphoria and despair simmered. He couldn't believe that his long-awaited triumph was overshadowed by such an absurd, ridiculous obstacle. Were these strict rules created to protect residents of an elite complex from inconveniences, stronger than his dream? Would his dog, the only living creature that had stayed by his side, become the sacrifice he would have to offer on the altar of success? He grabbed his phone and dialed the building manager's number. "Hello, this is Vaughn. I've accepted your job offer and I'm moving in. I'd like to know if an exception can be made for my dog. She's small, doesn't bark, and is well behaved. I guarantee she won't cause any problems." There was a plea in his voice, but he tried to sound firm, like a businessman who knows how to solve problems. He felt Millie, sensing his tone, come over and rest her head on his leg. Her warm, wet nose touched his pant leg. He gently, almost imperceptibly, stroked her head, as if apologizing for having to put her in this situation. The manager's voice was as cold and emotionless as the concrete walls of the elite complex. "I'm sorry, the rules are the same for everyone. We've had cases of complaints from neighbors. Let's not revisit this topic. You can leave the dog wherever you want, but you can't move her into the apartment. The decision is yours." These words sounded like a verdict, and Vaughn understood there would be no negotiation. His world, built on logic and agreements, had collapsed when it hit an insurmountable wall. Vaughn paced his apartment like a caged animal. His thoughts were like a swarm of angry bees. Giving up a dream job for a dog? That's absurd. He had worked so long for this. He had spent so much energy and so many nerves. His ex-wife left because he was always working, because he put his career above relationships. He didn't understand her then, thought she was selfish. But now, looking at Millie, he understood that maybe she was right. In his head, like a broken record, her phrase played, "You always choose work over living relationships." This phrase cut his heart like a sharp knife. Career, money, prestige, or a dog's devotion? What was more important? Where was the line he couldn't cross? He tried to find a temporary solution. Maybe he could arrange for one of his friends to take her for a few months until he figured out the housing situation and found a way around these idiotic rules. He started calling all his acquaintances, trying to convince them that his Millie was the best and most well-behaved dog in the world. "Just for a couple of months until I figure out the housing," he pleaded, his voice no longer firm but full of desperation. But everyone refused. His friend from high school said his wife was allergic to dogs. Another acquaintance he had recently met refused, saying she already had 2 cats and they wouldn't get along. And finally, his old buddy, who was always ready to help, said bluntly, "Vaughn, I can't. I don't want to take on someone else's problems. Understand, I have my own life." Each rejection was like a stab in the back. Vaughn felt lonely, abandoned, as if the whole world had conspired against him. He realized that his friends weren't the people who were willing to make sacrifices for his happiness. And he realized that his dog, who was everything to him, was actually of no use to anyone else. He looked at Millie, who, not understanding his torment, was circling nearby, trying to lick his hand, and he felt his heart break from the pain. He was cornered, and he had no other way out. He had to make a decision that would change not only his life but hers as well. And he knew that this decision would be the hardest of his life. But he was sure that it was the only right decision for his future. The betrayal. The time for making a decision was melting away rapidly, like snow under the spring sun. The days merged into one big, agonizing lump, filled with nervous tension and an unbearable sense of guilt. Vaughn couldn't sleep at night. He lay in the darkness, and in his head, Like a persistent swarm of flies, the same thoughts buzzed. He tried to find a way out, tried to convince himself that his action wasn't a betrayal, but just a necessary measure. And he found a way to protect his mind from this painful truth: self-deception. He began to convince himself that Millie was a smart dog, that she was strong, that she would adapt. She's not just a dog, she's a purebred, he told himself, looking at her curly snow-white fur. She's beautiful. Someone will definitely take her in. Maybe some kind old lady who lives in a house with a yard. She'll have her own lawn, she'll run and play. She'll be better off than in this cramped city apartment. These thoughts were like a lifeline that he desperately clung to so as not to drown in a sea of guilt. He invented a new ideal future for her, one that he wasn't a part of. He created a world in his head where Millie would be happy without him. And this gave him a false sense of peace. He didn't want to see her tears, her confusion. He wanted to believe that he was doing her a favor, that he was giving her a chance at a better life. With each passing day, his self-deception became more sophisticated. He began to prepare Millie for independence. This process was no less tormenting for him than it was for her. He would take her out for what seemed like a normal walk, then, under some contrived pretext, he would leave her alone in the yard for several hours. The first time he did it, his heart pounded like crazy. He sat in his car, parked around the corner, and watched her. Millie, not understanding what was happening, sat by the entrance, patiently waiting for him to come back. She didn't whine, didn't bark, she just waited. And Vaughn, looking at her, felt tears well up in his eyes. But he convinced himself, this is necessary. She needs to get used to it. It's for her own good. Each time he increased the time she was on her own, and each time his heart ached with pain. Millie didn't understand what was happening. Her world, which had once been so simple and clear, suddenly became alien and hostile. Her owner became nervous. He often yelled on the phone. His voice was full of tension and anger. He smelled of strange scents, the scent of a new job, new people, an alien world that had no place for her. He stopped playing with her, stopped caressing her. When she tried to comfort him, bringing him her favorite toy, resting her head on his knees, he would pull away. He didn't look her in the eyes. He was afraid to see in them something he couldn't bear, the boundless love and devotion he was about to betray. In the last days before starting his new job, Vaughn finally broke. He couldn't sleep at night, he couldn't eat. His thoughts were like leaves swirling in a whirlpool. He stopped talking to Millie. He just looked at her and felt something dying inside him. He knew he had to do it. He had to choose, and he had chosen. Early in the morning, when the neighbors were still asleep and the street was quiet and empty, he took Millie outside. The air was cool and fresh, but for Vaughn it was suffocating. He led her to their favorite bench, where they often sat together, and tied her leash to the leg. Millie, thinking this was one of their games, happily circled nearby, wagging her tail. She didn't know this was her last walk with him. Vaughn knelt down, hugged her, and buried his face in her soft, home-scented fur. "I'm sorry, girl, I can't miss this opportunity," he said to her, his voice trembling. "You'll understand when you grow up." He didn't believe his own words. He knew she wouldn't grow up. She wouldn't understand. She would just wait. But these words were his only pathetic attempt to justify himself. He quickly stood up, turned around, and walked away. He didn't look back. He couldn't. He couldn't see her eyes, full of bewilderment and boundless love. He walked quickly, trying not to hear her quiet, plaintive whimpering. He was walking toward his new, brilliant life, leaving behind what was real in his old one. A new beginning. The sun was already setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, when Andrew, walking unhurriedly, turned onto his street. His workday, full of numbers, reports, and monotonous conversations, was behind him, and he was looking forward to being home, where he could finally unwind. His thoughts were occupied with plans for the evening. Dinner, a book, maybe a movie. This was his ordinary, familiar world, one with no room for surprises. However, this evening, as it turned out, was going to be special. As he approached the entrance of the neighboring building, his gaze caught a small, white, curly ball of fur. It was a dog, a small poodle, sitting by the door, pressed against the cold wall. Her posture was so still and so full of expectation that Andrew, involuntarily slowing his pace, stopped to look at her. The dog sat like a statue. Her dark, intelligent eyes were fixed on the closed door, and in them boundless hope could be read. She didn't bark, didn't whine, didn't try to get attention. She just waited. The owner is probably inside, Andrew thought. This thought was the most obvious and logical one. Many residents left their pets by the entrance for a short time. He shrugged, smiled at the touching scene, and continued on his way, not giving it much thought. He didn't know that this dog, this small white ball of fur, would become a part of his life, changing it forever. But that evening, returning home, he saw her again. The sky had already turned dark, the first streetlights had come on, and their cold yellow light fell on her small, dirty figure. Now she wasn't sitting by the door. She was rummaging in the garbage can. Her nose, once so clean and wet, was covered in dirt. Her posture, which had been full of hope during the day, was now full of despair. She was trembling from the cold, her tail was tucked, and she, like a frightened animal, looked around, afraid that someone would notice her. Andrew stopped, and his heart clenched with pain. He knew this dog. He knew her owner. It was Vaughn. He remembered how they crossed paths in the elevator, how they exchanged polite but superficial phrases about the weather and neighborhood problems. He remembered how Vaughn always walked his dog, how he took care of her, how he played with her at the playground. The guy seemed responsible, always taking care of his dog. And now his dog was in the garbage can. Maybe something happened to the owner? The thought, full of worry, pierced him. He couldn't believe that a person could so easily throw away their friend. He tried to call her over. "Millie, come here," he said softly, holding out his hand. But the dog, hearing an unfamiliar voice, ran away in fear. She hid under a bush. Her eyes, full of terror, looked at him. Andrew realized that this wasn't just a lost dog. This was a house poodle who had never known street life. She was scared, confused, and her world, which had been cozy and safe just yesterday, had suddenly become alien and dangerous. Andrew, looking at her, felt anger rise in his soul. Anger at Vaughn, anger at the world's indifference, anger at himself for not giving it more thought during the day. He couldn't just walk past. He couldn't leave her on the street, knowing that she wouldn't survive there. He knew he had to do something. He had to help her. And without a second thought, he made a decision that would change not only her life but his as well. Andrew couldn't just walk past. His legs, which had so confidently carried him home just a few minutes ago, now seemed to be rooted to the ground. He looked at the small, trembling ball of fur that had huddled under the bush, and he felt a storm of indignation rise in his soul. He wasn't an animal lover, not a shelter volunteer, not an activist. He was just an ordinary person who was going home after a hard day's work. But he couldn't look on indifferently at someone else's pain. He couldn't allow this defenseless, frightened creature to spend the night on the street in the cold and fear. It was beyond his strength, beyond his principles. He quickly went up to his apartment. His heart was pounding wildly. He found an old, shallow bowl, filled it with water, and took some sausage from the refrigerator. His movements were quick, but there was no fuss in them. There was determination. He went back down to the yard, and the dog, seeing him, backed away in fear again. She looked at him with distrust. Her eyes, full of fear, were fixed on his hands. Andrew crouched down so as not to seem so big and intimidating, and he spoke softly, gently. "Hi, little one. Don't be afraid, I won't hurt you. Here, drink some water." Millie, obeying her instincts, slowly and cautiously approached the bowl. Her tongue, like a small pink petal, touched the water, and she began to drink greedily. Apparently, she hadn't eaten or drunk in a long time. After the water, she cautiously approached the sausage, and her nose, once so clean, now smudged with dirt, carefully sniffed the treat. Hunger overcame fear, and she began to eat. She ate greedily, quickly, but she kept looking around. Her eyes were fixed on the entrance door. She was waiting. She was still waiting for her owner. This sight pierced Andrew like a sharp knife. He couldn't understand how someone could so easily betray someone who loved them so boundlessly. This won't do, Andrew decided when the dog finished eating. He realized he couldn't just sit and wait for the owner to return. If he had wanted to, he would have done so already. He went up to Vaughn's apartment and knocked. Silence. He knocked again, harder. No answer. He rang the doorbell. Silence. His heart sank with disappointment and worry. He didn't know what to do. At that moment, the door to the neighboring apartment opened a crack, and an elderly woman, their mutual neighbor, Nina, peered out. Seeing Andrew, she smiled at him, but her gaze was full of sympathy. "You mean the little dog?" she said in a quiet, soft voice. "Don't worry, I've been keeping an eye on her. I just fed her a little while ago when you weren't looking. The poor thing. Her owner, Vaughn, left yesterday. He said he was moving for a new job. I don't know, maybe he forgot her in his haste." Andrew laughed. It was a bitter, painful laugh. Forgot? How is that even possible? He thought. He couldn't believe that someone could forget their friend, a member of their family. He knew she hadn't been forgotten. She had been deliberately left behind, thrown away like an old, useless item. He looked at Nina and said, "I can't let her spend the night on the street." There was no anger in his voice, only determination. He turned and went down to the courtyard. His heart, which had been full of anxiety just moments ago, was now filled with fury. Fury at Vaughn, at his selfishness, at his indifference. He knew he had to do something. He had to help her. And without a second thought, he made a decision that would change not only her life but his as well. The rescue. He went down the steps, his stride firm and confident, as if he wasn't just walking into the courtyard, but toward his new destiny. When Andrew reached the courtyard, twilight had fully settled, turning the familiar outlines of the buildings and trees into vague, faceless shadows. A street lamp hanging over the entrance cast a dull yellow light that only emphasized the gloom. Millie, that small, once snow-white ball of fur, was huddled under the entrance stairs. It was the darkest and most secluded place she could find. There, among the dust, cobwebs, and cigarette butts, she felt a semblance of safety. But it was not safety, only a pathetic illusion. She was trembling not only from the cold but from terror. Her world, which had been warm and familiar just yesterday, had suddenly become alien, huge, and dangerous. Every rustle, every sound startled her. Millie was waiting, but with each passing minute, her hope, the only thing keeping her there, was melting like a piece of ice on hot asphalt. Andrew, noticing her in the corner slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements, knelt down next to her. He didn't get too close, leaving enough distance between them so she wouldn't feel threatened. He spoke to her quietly and gently, and his voice, which she had only heard in passing, suddenly became the only familiar sound in this hostile world. "Hey, little one. Do you remember me? We're neighbors. I know your owner." The dog froze when she heard his voice. Her trembling intensified, but she didn't run away. She watched him, and in her dark, distrustful eyes, all her confusion was clear. She didn't understand what was happening. Why had the owner she loved more than anything in the world left her? Why was this stranger who smelled different trying to talk to her? She wanted to believe that her owner would return, but somewhere deep in her little heart, a terrible, agonizing doubt was beginning to form. Andrew didn't push. He just sat there, allowing her to get used to his presence. He held out his hand, palm up, and in it was a small piece of cheese. "Want some? I won't hurt you," he said. And these words weren't just an offer. They were a promise. The dog looked at the cheese, and a real battle was raging in her little mind. The hunger she had felt since morning was strong. It reminded her of itself with an unpleasant, gnawing feeling in her stomach. But fear was even stronger. Fear of the unknown, fear of a person, fear of betrayal. She didn't know if she could trust him. She didn't know what this stranger would do to her. And yet hunger won over caution. Millie slowly, very slowly, crawled out of her hiding place. Every step she took was measured, full of tension. She came up to Andrew's hand. Her nose carefully sniffed the cheese, and as if afraid of being seen, she quickly, almost stealthily, took the treat. She swallowed it and went back to her hiding place. Andrew, without moving, offered her another piece. Then another. With each new piece of cheese, her fear lessened. Her trust, which had been shattered in a single day, was slowly being restored one piece at a time. She understood that this person didn't want to harm her. He just wanted to help. When Millie ate the last piece, Andrew stood up. "Let's go home," he said softly, and something in his voice made the dog trust him. It wasn't a command, it was an invitation. There was no anger in that voice, no irritation, no nervous note that had appeared in Vaughn's voice in recent days. There was only one emotion: sincere, deep compassion. Perhaps she was just tired of being afraid. She was tired of the cold, the hunger, the loneliness. She was tired of waiting. And when Andrew held out his arms to her, she didn't resist. He carefully, as if afraid of crushing her, picked her up. Millie, who had been trembling with terror, suddenly stopped. She pressed against him. Her little body relaxed, and she buried her nose in his shoulder. It wasn't just a physical act. It was the beginning of a new life. Andrew, holding her in his arms, walked toward his apartment building. In that moment, he left behind not just a stranger's dog, but a stranger's problem. He found not just a pet, but a friend. And Millie, tired and exhausted, found her new real home. Andrew, holding Millie in his arms, climbed the stairs, and each step was filled with a feeling he couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't just compassion, but a deep, inner sense of responsibility that had settled on his shoulders as unexpectedly as this dog had settled in his arms. A new home. He entered his apartment, clean, quiet, and orderly, where every item had its place, and where until that moment, there had been no one but himself. The smell coming from the small, trembling body was unpleasant, a sharp smell of street dirt, garbage, and fear. It was the smell of another's pain that filled his home. But Andrew felt no disgust. He only felt determination. He immediately took her to the bathroom, gently placed her in the tub, and filled it with warm water. The water running off her snow-white fur was dirty, like a spring stream carrying all the dirt of melting snow. Andrew, who had never dealt with dogs before, acted instinctively but with incredible care. He washed her gently and softly, rinsing away not only the dirt but also the terror she had experienced. Millie, who had been trembling with fear just moments before, stood quietly. She didn't resist or try to get away. Her posture was full of submission, as if she understood that this person would not harm her. She just let him do what he was doing. Her eyes were closed with pleasure and relief. She, who had been terrified, now felt safe under the stream of warm water. After her bath, Andrew wrapped her in a large, soft towel. Her small body, which had been dirty and smelled of trash, now smelled of clean dog fur and some faint, distant scent of shampoo. He took a hairdryer and carefully, trying not to frighten her, dried her. Millie, who had never heard such a loud sound, flinched but didn't run away. She simply pressed against his hand, and her little body was full of trust. When her fur was completely dry, she turned out to be not just a dog, but an incredibly beautiful snow-white poodle with shiny, intelligent dark eyes that looked at him with gratitude. "You're a real beauty, aren't you?" Andrew smiled, and in that moment he knew he couldn't just give her away. He laid a soft, warm blanket for her next to his bed and set out bowls of food and water. Millie, who had been hungry for more than a day, ate greedily and quickly, but she didn't forget to look around. She watched his every move. Her eyes, full of caution, never left him. After eating, she lay down on the blanket, but her eyes didn't close. She lay there. Her little body was relaxed, but her gaze was alert. She wasn't sleeping. She was just watching. She was used to waiting. She was used to her owner coming back. She was used to him abandoning her. And not knowing if she could trust this person, she just waited. Andrew turned off the light, got into bed, and for a long time in the darkness, he watched her. He didn't know what he was going to do with this dog. He didn't know how he would feed her or walk her. He didn't know how he would explain her appearance to his friends. But he knew one thing. He couldn't give her away. He knew he had to do something. And he knew he had to help her. He closed his eyes, and in his head, like a broken record, the same thoughts spun. He thought about Vaughn, and he knew he had to talk to him. He had to understand how a person could so easily betray someone who loved them so boundlessly. And he knew he had to find the answer. The confrontation. Morning came differently than usual. Sunlight streaming through the blinds filled the apartment. But for Andrew, this morning was special. A new resident had arrived in his home. Millie, who had lain on her new blanket all night without ever falling asleep, was now cautiously exploring the apartment in the morning light. Every step she took was silent, every movement careful. She didn't run or jump. She just walked, and her nose was always moving. She was inhaling new scents, studying a new world. Andrew, waking up, watched her, and something new was rising in his soul. It was a feeling he couldn't immediately define. It wasn't just compassion. It was a sense of home. His home, which had been just an apartment yesterday, was suddenly filled with life. However, this new feeling did not make him forget the old problem. He had to find Vaughn. He had to understand how a person could so easily betray his friend. And he had to give him a chance, one last chance, to correct his mistake. Andrew knew it wouldn't be easy. He understood that Vaughn would probably not want to talk to him, but he had to try. After drinking his coffee, Andrew took out his phone and called the building manager. He explained the situation without going into details and asked for Vaughn's number. The manager, who was surprised by his request, hesitated at first, but then, after much persuasion, agreed. "All right," he said, "but I can't guarantee that he'll answer." He asked not to be disturbed. Andrew thanked him, took the number, and his heart began to beat wildly. He knew this call would change everything. He dialed the number, and his finger hovered over the call button. He took a deep breath, exhaled, and pressed it. After several long, agonizing rings, a voice came on the line. "Hello." Vaughn's voice was full of tension. He was probably expecting a call from his new job and was ready for a business conversation. "Hello, this is about your dog," Andrew began, not trying to soften the blow. A long, agonizing pause. Andrew could hear him breathing. He heard a silence that was louder than any words. "How is she?" was Vaughn's first question. There was tenderness in his voice, pain, something that made Andrew feel a moment of pity for him. But that pity immediately vanished. "She's alive. I took her in," Andrew said, and his voice was cold as ice. "But why did you leave her?" Silence fell again on the other end of the line. Vaughn was apparently gathering his thoughts, trying to find the right words. "It's a complicated story," he began, and Andrew immediately detected the insincerity in his voice. "New job, company apartment, no pets allowed there." He spoke as if it were an explanation, as if it were a sufficient justification. He spoke as if he were a victim of circumstances, not a person who had made a decision. Andrew, having heard the explanation, didn't understand the logic. "Then come and get her," he said. There was no anger in his voice, only logic. "Find another solution. She's your dog, your friend. You can't just abandon her like that. But Vaughn, who had already made his decision, couldn't simply go back on it. He had already passed the point of no return. What solution? I've already tried everything. His voice now sounded irritated. I looked for friends, but no one wanted to take her. I had to do it. I thought someone would pick her up quickly. She's a purebred after all. She's beautiful. Someone will take her. Andrew held the phone and remained silent for a long time. He listened to Vaughn's words, and in his mind, like a kaleidoscope, images swirled. Millie trembling in the garbage can, her eyes full of terror, and her small dirty body that he carried in his arms. And now he was hearing the voice of a man who talked about her as if she were a thing, an object that could simply be discarded if it didn't fit into a new decor. A purebred, beautiful. These words, which should have been a compliment, now sounded like a verdict, a cynical justification for the lowest kind of act. Andrew realized that this wasn't just a person who had gotten into a difficult situation. This was a person who had made his choice. And that choice was not in favor of love and devotion. There was no anger in Andrew's voice, no judgment, only a weariness from other people's problems and an irresistible desire to help this dog. You know what? Andrew said after a long silence, and his voice was as hard as steel. I'm keeping her. We've already become friends. These words were not a question or a request. It was a statement, final and irrevocable. He no longer wanted to listen to Vaughn's justifications or immerse himself in his complex, tangled life. He just wanted to help this small creature who had suffered so unjustly. He had made his choice. And this choice was not in favor of work or money. It was made in favor of a living relationship. Vaughn on the other end of the line felt relief and shame at the same time. He got what he wanted. The dog was no longer his problem. He could move into his elite apartment without worrying about what the neighbors or the managers would say. But along with that relief came a feeling of shame that pierced him like a sharp knife. He knew he had lost. He hadn't lost in his career or in money. He had lost something more important. Thank you. I'll transfer money for her upkeep, he said. And his voice was full of awkwardness. He was trying to buy himself forgiveness, trying to buy his way out of his guilt, but Andrew, who had already made his decision, would not let him do that. No need, Andrew cut him off. If you give her away, you give her away completely. She's no longer yours. These words, simple and ruthless, put a definitive end to their story. Millie, who for Vaughn was a symbol of his old failed life, now became part of a new one. Andrew, who had never thought about a dog, now thought about her constantly. He renamed her Bella, not out of dislike for her old name, but to help her start a new life, to erase all traces of a past that had been so painful. And Bella, who was once Millie, quickly got used to her new home. But for the first few days, when she heard footsteps that sounded like Vaughn's, she would still run to the window. Her small, devoted heart couldn't forget the one she loved so quickly. She waited, her gaze full of hope, and Andrew, watching her, felt his heart ache with pain. But time is the best healer. With each passing day, each new morning, each new touch and kind word, her fear and pain disappeared. A month later, she was already greeting Andrew at the door, wagging her tail happily. In her eyes, which had been full of terror just a short time ago, there was now only love and boundless devotion. She had stopped waiting for her old owner. She had found a new one, and this new owner had given her what the old one couldn't: a real home. And Vaughn, in his elite sterile apartment, sometimes caught himself automatically looking for a small white curly ball of fur in the corner of the room. He had achieved everything he wanted. He had his dream job, money, and prestige, but there was an emptiness in his life that seemed to grow bigger and bigger. Everyone got what they chose. Vaughn got a career, money, and loneliness. Andrew got a friend, love, and true happiness. And in this story there was no moral, no right and wrong. There was only one simple truth. A choice does not always bring the expected happiness. Sometimes, to find happiness, you just have to open your heart to someone who needs it.